Hi, I'm Robert Tolpe, and today I'm going to be talking about something controversial. I know this is a bad look to many of you, as it looks like I'm going to validate a question that people rightfully consider to be transphobic. That is, do trans women trick men into sex by virtue of being trans? If you haven't gathered already, it's transphobic because it makes the false assumption that trans women aren't women, but rather they impersonate women in order to trick men into sleeping with them. The reality is, however, that trans women are women, and they certainly don't trick men into having sex by existing. So if I'm not going to entertain the blatant transphobia of that question, then why do I bring it up? I mention it because many people who ask this question, as unaware as they may be about its transphobic implications, also raise a valid question about consent involving trans women. That is, whether a trans woman has to disclose the fact that she's trans to a partner that she knows would never have sex with her if they knew that. And if she doesn't disclose that information, is the resulting sex fully consensual? I know many of you will want to dismiss that question as transphobic too, and believe me, I want to as well. In fact, I felt for a while that the question shouldn't even be entertained, as even hinting that it may or may not be morally wrong for trans women to conceal their identity to avoid being killed could come across as blaming them for men's unjustified violence against them. But despite how touchy this subject is, to say the least, I know this question lingers in the back of a lot of people's minds. And if we don't address it, it could rot there and possibly result in more transphobia. I know that many people like myself don't have an intimate understanding of what it's like to be trans. So we go in search of facts and logic to try and answer questions that trans women already instinctively know the answers to. So to answer this question, we have to deeply consider the perspective of trans women, who have made brilliant videos about the subject that I will cite. But I will also bring up an ethical argument made by an influential scholar as well, in order to flesh out the misconceptions that very many people have in a coherent way. By now, I hope that I've convinced you that I'm not a bigot, and I think it's time to dive deep into this perilous topic, so let's watch while I ruin my career, shall we? I want you to think for a moment if you've ever said something slightly dishonest to get laid. You know, maybe you said you were a natural blonde when you were actually a brunette. Or you said that you were only 45 a day after you renewed your AARP membership. For many of you, your answer might be yes. And even if you haven't told a little white lie yourself, then you've certainly been with someone who has a fair share of half-truths filling their Tinder bio. These little concealments of information are so common when it comes to sexual encounters that your average person would say it's only a minor wrong to deceive someone about your hair color or age when it comes to a sexual relationship. However, a man by the name of Tom Doherty would disagree with this lenient thesis. In his controversial article, Sex, Lies, and Consent, Doherty asserts that any kind of withholding of information that might be of concern to one's sexual partner, no matter how minor that information may seem, is seriously morally wrong, and that sex involving these minor deceptions is not consensual. Now, this is where I get really nervous, as I'm essentially broadcasting a well-crafted, scholarly argument that could be used to imply that trans women deceive men into having non-consensual sex. But there's a reason why I bring forward this argument. By targeting a well-articulated position instead of the incoherent rantings of some transphobe, I hope I can properly express the problems that arguments like Doherty's have, especially when applying them to a trans woman's situation. In his article, Doherty explains what morally wrong deception might look like and what it entails. Firstly, any deception must concern the sex itself, and as consenting to sex involves accepting who a person really is, then any deception regarding themselves, from concealing their hair color to their real profession, is pertinent. Secondly, and most importantly, the deception must be about a deal breaker to the other person, i.e., if they knew the truth, they would not have consented to sex. So, does not revealing that you're trans to someone that you know would not have sex with you if they knew that you were trans constitute morally unacceptable deception to Doherty? Well, Yes. I'd like to clarify that deception in this case is not saying anything along the lines of I'm a woman or passing, as those are matters of the reality that trans women are women. There's no deception involved in that. The deception, by Doherty's definition, would lie in the fact of you withholding that you're a trans woman from your sexual partner. To Doherty, that would indeed be morally unacceptable, as it certainly pertains to the person that you're having sex with, and to them, it's a deal breaker. Doherty argues that having sex involving these deceptions, no matter how minor they may be, is having sex without someone's morally valid consent. And because having non-consensual sex is seriously morally wrong, then being deceptive in this way is also seriously morally wrong. In this video, I will unfortunately have to explain his argument, but I will voice my many concerns with it, and the many problems with his reasoning, and just finally explain why this really doesn't apply to trans women that well at all, no matter how well crafted of an argument it might be. To introduce Doherty's thesis, I would like to bring forward an analogy similar to one in the paper, and it might be frustrating at first to hear this, but just stick with me, we'll get through it. A woman asks a man if she can bring flowers over to his house. She knows that this man hates lilacs, as he has talked ad nauseum about his irrational hatred of lilacs. He consents, however, to her bringing flowers over to his house, expecting that they are not lilacs, as she knows that he hates lilacs. The woman later shows up to his house with a giant bouquet of lilacs, and he feels very upset, like his house was violated by these lilacs, and tells the woman, "I did not consent to you bringing lilacs over to my house." She retorts, "Yes, you did. You consented to me bringing flowers over, and lilacs are flowers, so your consent was morally valid, and I did nothing wrong." Doherty would argue that the woman did something morally wrong in this case by not unknowingly, but knowingly bringing lilacs into his house despite knowing that he hates them, all without telling him. And that means the consent that he gave to allow her to bring flowers into his home was not morally valid in this case. You can quickly see how someone might apply this to trans women. A trans woman asks a man to have sex, or a man asks a trans woman to have sex, for that matter, and she proceeds forward without revealing that she is trans, knowing that he hates trans women and wouldn't agree to sex if he knew. Despite him consenting to sleeping with a beautiful woman, Doherty would argue that he never provided morally valid consent to sleeping with a beautiful trans woman, in the same way that the man in the analogy consented to receiving flowers, but would have never consented to have receiving lilacs, which are indeed beautiful flowers. But the distinction of what type of flowers, though trivial to most people, was a deal breaker to him. Because the trans woman knowingly had sex with a man that wouldn't have consented if he knew that she was trans, Doherty would argue that she did something morally wrong. There are a lot of problems with that idea. We'll unpack them. But instinctively, many can understand where Doherty is coming from. I think that many people who are critical of trans women who don't reveal that they are trans to those that they have sex with instinctively agree with Doherty's position, as Doherty's position on its own makes sense. Consent is not morally valid if it's not fully informed. And it's even worse if someone is intentionally deceiving someone by Doherty's definition. Sex, contingent on this kind of deception, which could be as serious as falsely claiming you're a film producer and that you'll cast them if they have sex with you, or as trivial as saying you're a natural blonde when that might be a deal breaker for some, is morally wrong. Although these examples are on very different levels of moral wrongness. But beyond that, Doherty's argument falls flat on a lot of his points, and when you apply it to trans women, it completely falls apart. Doherty's position makes a couple of assumptions. It assumes that why having sex with someone without their consent is wrong because it lacks consent, not because of the harm that someone faces because of the ensuing non-consensual sex. It also assumes that the moral wrong of this non-consensual sex outweighs the reasons why someone might not be entirely honest about themselves in the bedroom. I will address these assumptions and what I think about them as well as citing a popular trans woman's experience, which provided me vital insight into the realities of consenting to sex while being trans, as lofty philosophical arguments get thrown out the window when your life could be in danger. When it comes to the premise that having sex without someone's consent is wrong because it lacks consent, and not because of the overall harm that occurs because of the ensuing sex, I actually agree with Doherty on this point. I'm really reluctant, however, to agree with how he illustrates this point. He uses, and bear with me now, the example of a comatose patient being assaulted to illustrate how non-consensual sex can be morally wrong without involving any harm to that patient at all, which is both a piss-poor analogy and a good example at the same time. I will be explaining at the moment why the analogy serves a good purpose, despite being ridiculous. It shows that in this case, which is assaulting an unconscious person, it is morally wrong even if no harm to the person is done and no evidence is left behind. You see, this overly severe analogy illustrates clearly that something morally wrong can occur with no physical or emotional harm occurring, meaning that the moral wrong lies in a lack of consent. But what about trans women or people with dyed hair? This is where the analogy completely falls apart, which is not to say it was very good in the first place. It completely ignores any possible gradations of wrongness that exist in a world where nothing is as black and white as thing really, really bad or thing really, really good. It's pretty obvious that not revealing your natural hair color to someone you have sex with is not equal to the moral wrong of assaulting someone in a coma. And you could defend an ironclad PhD thesis on why it is actually comparable, but you'd be wasting your breath. Some things are just false, no matter how much BS you write saying that they're true. Just rely on your gut instinct here. I hope that's the end of that line of thought, but I'd imagine many of you agree with me on that point anyways. The real issue here is that a lot of people believe that someone not revealing that they're trans is a grave moral wrong in itself. I consider that idea to be transphobic. Let me explain why. 9 times out of 10, being trans is only a relevant detail when you have to go to the doctor's office to be tested for something that specifically involves your anatomy and genetics. In daily life, your anatomy and genetics are not visible to anyone except for people with like x-ray vision. So many trans women have gotten extensive surgeries to the point at which your experience with them, both in casual conversation and even in the bedroom, is indistinguishable from an experience with a cis woman. So, in practice, this necessity for women to disclose their chromosomes to every man they ever meet is about as important in the grand scheme of things as her revealing that she has O positive blood, as in the fact doesn't change anything about your fundamental experience with her. I guess you could say that it's important for trans women to disclose their chromosomes because they cannot bear children. But why do trans women have to do this when discussing whether you want kids or not before you've even had sex is certainly not required for infertile cis women? Socially speaking, whether you're trans or cis, you simply don't have to bring up anything pertaining to having a family for every one-night stand you have. That's creepy. The most egregious talking point I hear from people is that trans women have to disclose whether they're trans or not, such that they don't manipulate a man's sexuality. That is just nonsense, as having sex with a trans woman doth not maketh a straight man gay, as it must needs be remarked that it's pretty straight for a man to have sex with a woman. Not only is the idea false, but it's very obviously false, to the point at which I'm inclined to believe that people who call these men gay for being attracted to trans women instinctively know that it's only men who have heterosexual attraction that are attracted to trans women. I mean, how could you possibly fathom that any actually gay man would be attracted to someone who looks like this? It's crazy. They're just using the label gay to emasculate and distance themselves from men who date trans women, so they don't have to take on the stigma that these men face. So if not revealing that you're trans to someone is not bad in itself, and certainly not akin to assault, then why should trans women do it anyways? Well, I'm inclined to believe that is still an important part of consent. It's just best practice to reveal to a partner that you're trans when you know it would be a deal breaker for them, even if it's only a deal breaker because of their prejudice. I know many of you will say it's wrong to discriminate, and while I agree that discrimination is wrong, this is not a case like, for instance, a bakery turning down a gay couple for a wedding cake. This is someone's body, not a public business, and they have the right to be as discriminatory as they want when choosing who they want to have sex with. Also, I don't want to say that everyone who doesn't want to have sex with a trans woman is necessarily a bigot. They might just have strong arbitrary preferences, just like people who only want to have sex with Scorpios and Sagittariuses. People can be weird like that, but the burden is on these people with these specific deal breakers to reveal their arbitrary preferences to their sexual partners. Trans women just aren't mind readers, at least as far as I know. So if a guy doesn't want to sleep with a trans woman, he should communicate that very clearly. And if he doesn't communicate that clearly and consents to sex, he has no right to feel angry when he finds out that woman is trans. So if revealing that you're trans to your partner is best practice and should be part of the important process of consenting in a sexual encounter, then why should we excuse people's actions when they don't follow this practice? The reality is that best practice is not possible in real life situations. Cis people demanding that trans people must always reveal that they're trans every single time is kind of insensitive. As I said, you could talk about breast practice. As I said, we can talk about best practice and moral philosophy until we're blue in the face. But when a man is towering over you, making sexual advances, you might be in a very precarious situation where you might be killed if you say that you are trans. I remember watching a Kat Black video where she explains a situation like that from her life, where a man made advances on her, and she knew that at some point she had to tell him that she was trans, just out of best practice, but didn't want to literally risk her life to do so.
I remember the first time that I recognized that I was passing. This guy had asked me out on a date, and I thought that he knew. I genuinely thought that he knew that I was trans, and I didn't know that he didn't know until he tried to finger me. And I remember that in that situation, I felt like I needed to get out of that sort of intimate space and go home before I had the conversation. Because this guy was like a big biker dude, because my college tastes were very questionable. But he was a big biker dude, and I knew that if I talked to him about this, it could potentially end in him physically attacking me. And so for that reason, I wanted to be safe and make sure that I could have that conversation in a way where I wouldn't be hurt. And so I went home and I text messaged him, and of course he responded with, "If I ever see you again, I'm gonna fuck you up."
Even Doherty recognizes that in every situation, we must weigh any moral wrong from not revealing a piece of information about oneself against the possibility of facing some serious harm. He also recognizes the role of intent. Mostly trans women don't intend to gloss over their identity to get laid. They just have to protect themselves sometimes when they could be in grave danger. So by Doherty's own reasoning, their actions are justified. This is not to say there aren't young trans women who get excited that their partner didn't know they were transgender, even when their partner was transphobic. But young trans women and girls who do this type of thing are not very respected by grown adult trans women like Kat Black.
I've seen some trans women make content like this where it's like they're bragging about straight men being attracted to them, which, like, baby girl, find your standards. That's all I have to say. Not every single man who talks to me is a man that I'm interested in. So I don't really believe that every single man I talk to needs to know that I'm transgender. But I do personally believe that the men that I'm interested in, who I plan on being intimate with, do need to have that information so that they can make the decision for themselves.
So this idea that every trans woman has morally questionable intentions to seduce straight men is just not true and deeply, deeply rooted in transphobia. I hope I've made my points clear in this video. there's a high chance that I probably left something out or misspoke in a way that might get me canceled on Twitter. So let me summarize. It is best practice for trans women to reveal that they are trans to potential sexual partner, who they know would not engage in sex with them if they knew that they were trans. And not doing that when it doesn't pose any danger to them in some situations is morally questionable. But it's only about as morally questionable as not revealing that you dye your hair blonde to your partner. And certainly not as morally questionable as a grave wrong like assault, even if it was gravely morally wrong. In many cases, it just isn't safe for trans women to reveal that they are trans, lest they be killed. And certainly in these cases, any moral wrong that occurs by not revealing that they're trans is outweighed by the threat of being murdered. I hope that your takeaway from this is not the false and victim-blaming idea that any slight moral wrong a trans woman has done by not revealing they're trans to a potential murderer is a justification for potential violence against them. But if that's your takeaway, I probably couldn't convince you otherwise, but hey, at least I tried. Anyways, I'm Robert Tolpe, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And check out Kat Black and Natalie's channels linked below, as well as my Patreon linked below, because this video is hopelessly demonetized. Thank you so much for watching, though, and I hope you have a great week. And now it's time for a brief and cringy dance montage for my patrons on Patreon. I'm gonna do this sitting down. How do you vote? How do you vote?
I'ma hush the rumors and the doubt. Came in the game with a beat and a bounce. Never for the fame, my feet on the ground. Cloud number 9, headed to the stars. Maybe I'll ride with my mic and my bra. Maybe I'll recite in the raw. The appetite for life and the hunger for the more. The Allen of Manhattan.